Hey everybody, welcome to my overview video of Module 8's discussion, discussion 4. That's the discussion on agency and identity in archaeology, which I alluded to last week, but this is a really interesting discussion. And you guys said some really good things in your discussions with each other, so I'd like to highlight some of my favorite things that you guys said and also give my take on some of the questions that you answered last week. Um, so, without further ado, I'll just go over the questions and say what some of the groups said that I thought was good, and then give my take as well. All right, the first question. How was King Richard's agency expressed? How did his choices affect the structure of the society in which he lived? Now, I think before I answer this question, I'd like to give kind of a formal definition of agency because I know that certain groups have, or at least individuals in groups have had this question of what exactly is agency, and it is something that's kind of hard to pin down because it manifests itself in a lot of different ways. But the thing about agency is it's just an individual's ability to act in a social situation, or I guess I would say a socio-environmental situation, because everybody has agency to a certain degree. King Richard had a lot of agency because he was the king of England for I think 2 or 3 years, and he had the ability to impact his society in pretty significant ways because he had a lot of um, governing power. He was in battles that he won. He was in battles that he lost. He died, I think, at the last battle he fought in. But he had a lot more power to impact his society than somebody like in the reading that you guys did, Donna Marino, uh, who didn't have as much agency because she was basically subservient to the Spanish because she didn't really have any other choice, and she helped them out because she wanted to preserve her own well-being. So even if you're a person who lives in a cage for your entire life, you still have agency. It's just vastly, vastly limited compared to someone like Richard III. And I think that generally people picked up on the fact that he was a king, he was an elite in a society, so he had a lot more agency than somebody who was of a lower class. And the other important thing that a few groups picked up on was this idea that King Richard's legacy after he died was warped because of English society's ideas of what he was. It was sort of like a propaganda type thing. We don't really know what King Richard was actually like while he lived, but we know that the Tudors weren't really liked very much by English society after he died because he was seen as like an usurper. So uh, he's kind of painted in a bad light after his death. Um, oh, and also I think that a couple people brought up that he had a hunchback, which allowed us to figure out that it was his body that was found under that parking lot in England. At least that was part of what helped us figure it out, as well as the foods he ate because he was royalty. You could see in his bones that he was not like malnourished or anything. He ate a diet that had a lot of meat in it, like other elites probably would in that society. So we know this from looking at the remains of what we know is Richard III now. But what other archaeological examples can you give of individual agency? Are any prehistoric or ahistorical individuals? How did they express their agency? So this one is kind of hard. One of the examples that I saw 2 or 3 groups actually mention was Hatshepsut, the Egyptian pharaoh, who was a woman. So it was kind of strange for her to be pharaoh, but she was able to, I think, convince the society that she was in basically to allow her to be pharaoh, even though it wasn't really normal at the time. And then another group said that her stepson, I think, uh, basically tried to erase her legacy afterwards. So that was an example of him having agency. And I mean, after you die, you don't really have any agency at all. You can't decide what happens to your legacy. But during her life, she was what's the word? She was a pioneer in Egyptian society as far as her role as a ruler. So that was definitely a good example. A lot of people said Donna Marina because she was the example that was given in the reading. But as far as prehistoric individuals go, it's a lot harder to figure out what their identities were because we don't have any historical accounts of what they were like names or deeds. We only have like the remains of the past and the remains of the things that they did in some cases. Which brings us to the next question that is really interesting. Why is Ötzi's body not an example of prehistoric archaeological evidence of agency? And most people said for this one that it's not an example of agency because it doesn't show who Ötzi was as an individual. We don't really have a very good understanding of this society and how he was different than his society because we don't have any historical accounts of that region and the people who lived there. I mean, like, we generally know what they were like, in large part because of Ötzi. We have an idea of the sorts of things they did and the ways they dressed because we were able to find such a well-preserved example of this group in the permafrost. But we don't know exactly what he was like as an individual. Now, I actually do disagree with this question a little bit as far as Ötzi's body being an example of agency, because I think it actually is an example of agency to a certain degree. It doesn't really show, his body doesn't show who he was as a person to the same degree that Richard III's did, because Richard III's body comes with all of this historical evidence, accurate or not, but Ötzi's body still has, like, there are some things that we can point to tell us what sort of life he lived. We know that he was an older man for the time period, probably in his like late 30s or early 40s, based on his dentition, based on the growth of his long bones. We have an idea that he died probably in pain, probably fleeing from probably like a conflict with somebody else, because we know that there was an arrow lodged in his shoulder. We have an idea of when he died because of the paleontological remains that we found with the body, and we have an idea of how he dressed for certain reasons. So we have at least a profile of Ötzi and who he might have been as a person, but we don't have the same information that we'd have with like an enigmatic character like Richard III. But this doesn't mean that there's not agency, because I think that this shows that he does have agency, right? Because he's making the conscious decision to move across this mountain pass to do something. We don't know what, but he had the agency to at least move, probably fleeing from some sort of conflict. So at the very least, he did have agency, but we don't have the information to really pinpoint to what degree he had agency. And then the last question, let's see here, pull this one up. I don't know why it's not loading on my screen. Okay, this is a long one. Modern day descendants of Richard III are rather interested in and proud of excavations that revealed his body and raised no objections to its scientific study, which is contrasted to objections raised by Native Americans of the disturbance of their ancestral remains. Why are there differences? And I think that generally you guys did a really good job of pinpointing why there were differences between these two things. One of the reasons, obviously, is there's a cultural difference. I think that English people don't have the same connection to their ancestors culturally that Native Americans do. But another piece of that is that in Richard III's case, this is an example of English royalty who is being excavated by other Western people, English men. But in the case of Native American burials and archaeological excavations of those burials, it's an example of Westerners, probably Americans in most cases, excavating Native Americans. And this is just an example of continued structural violence against Native American people in the United States. So, of course, there's going to be backlash. They're not seen as having as much of a say as the descendants of Richard III, and they're not as, or the Native Americans that are connected to burials are more connected, I would argue, than the people who are connected to Richard III. I would say that the people who were descendants of Richard III, in large part, kind of see it more as a novelty that they're related to him, rather than Native American peoples who are related to their ancestors' remains, because it's part of their ontology, it's part of their identity, it's part of who they are. And that's not necessarily saying that that's not the case with Richard III's descendants, because maybe it is who they are. But it's definitely not to the same degree. And that, combined with the power dynamic that I just talked about, is they're the main reasons why they're different. And pretty much every group picked up on that, which I was really happy to see. So that's it for me for this week. Hopefully everybody enjoyed the reading and the questions. I look forward to your discussion for this week as well. Thank you, and I hope you have a good week.